There's a mistake almost every single apartment plant owner makes, and it has nothing to do with water. It has nothing to do with soil. It has nothing to do with fertilizer. And it's the reason your plant looks weaker every month, even if you're doing everything else right. Here's what they don't tell you when you buy a plant. They don't tell you that the spot where you're about to put it, the one that looks bright enough to your eyes, might already be a slow death sentence. Not because the plant will drop the dead in a week. It won't. It'll hang on for months, sometimes even a year, looking okay-ish, getting weaker, in ways you can't quite put your finger on until one day it just gives up. And by then, you're going to blame the water. You're going to blame the soil. You're going to blame everything except the real problem. Stick with me because by the end of this, you're going to walk around your own apartment and look at your plants completely differently. I've talked to so many people who kept a plant alive for months, sometimes over a year, doing everything they thought was right. Watering on schedule, fertilizing on time, checking the soil, and the plant still slowly fell apart. Leaves getting smaller, stems getting thin and stretched out, growth basically stopping. And every single time, the first thing they say is, I think I'm overwatering it, or maybe it needs different soil. But almost every time, that's not it. The real problem is something way less obvious and way harder to notice because it's not something that happens in a day. It happens over weeks and months, so slowly that your eyes get used to it before you even realize what's going on. The mistake is light, not water. Light. And I don't mean the plant is in a dark room, that part people usually catch. I mean something way more sneaky, which is thinking a spot is bright enough when it's actually nowhere close to what the plant needs. Let me explain why this happens, because once you understand it, you'll never look at a bright room the same way again. Our eyes are incredibly good at adjusting to different light levels. That's actually the whole problem. When you walk into a room during the day, even a room that only gets a little bit of natural light, your eyes adjust almost instantly, and the room looks bright to you. Your brain just doesn't register how dim it actually is because it's constantly comparing it to whatever you were looking at a second ago. Plants don't work that way. Plants don't have eyes that adjust. Plants respond to the actual amount of usable light hitting their leaves, measured in something called foot candles or lux, and that number drops off insanely fast the further you move away from a window. Here's a number that surprises almost everyone. Direct sunlight outside can hit over 10,000 foot candles. Right next to a window, depending on the direction it faces, you might get somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000. But move that same plant just 3 feet away from the window, and the light can drop to under 200 foot candles. Move it to the middle of the room or on a shelf against the opposite wall, and you're often down to under 50. That's a massive difference. And to your eyes, all of those spots can look pretty similar because your brain is doing that automatic adjustment I just talked about. So people put a plant that needs bright indirect light on a shelf that looks perfectly fine to them, but is actually getting a tiny fraction of what the plant needs to function properly. And here's the part that really gets people. The plant doesn't die from that right away. It survives. It just survives badly. This is where the slow decline comes in, and this is the part that fools almost everyone. When a plant doesn't get enough light, it doesn't just stop growing and sit there looking the same. It starts making changes to try to survive, and those changes are the exact signs people misread as watering problems, pest problems, or soil problems. The first thing that happens is something called etiolation. That's when a plant, starved for light, starts stretching itself out, growing longer stems with more space between the leaves, trying to reach toward whatever light it can find. People see a plant getting leggy and think it just needs a trim, when really the plant is telling you it's desperately searching for more light. The second thing that happens is the leaves get smaller. Every new leaf that grows in low light comes in a little smaller than the last one because the plant simply doesn't have enough energy from photosynthesis to build big, full leaves anymore.
This happens so gradually that most people don't notice until they compare an old leaf to a new one side by side, and suddenly the difference is obvious. The third thing, and this is the one that really confuses people, is that low light plants become way more sensitive to watering mistakes. Here's why. A plant that's getting enough light is using water quickly because it's actively photosynthesizing and growing. But a plant that's starved for light barely uses any water at all because it's not doing much of anything. So if you keep watering it on the same schedule you always have, that water just sits in the soil for way longer than it should because the plant isn't pulling it out fast enough anymore. This is where the misdiagnosis happens. The soil stays wet longer than normal. The roots start struggling. You see yellow leaves, mushy stems, maybe even root rot starting to form. And your first instinct, completely reasonably, is to think, I'm overwatering this plant. So you cut back on water. But the real root cause was never the amount of water you were giving it. It was the lack of light making the plant unable to use that water properly in the first place. That's the trap. Low light causes symptoms that look exactly like overwatering. So people fix the wrong problem over and over while the plant keeps declining in a spot that was never bright enough to begin with. Now let me get into what actually counts as enough light, because this is where most of the confusion starts. There are 3 general categories people talk about: low light, medium or indirect light, and bright indirect light. But here's the thing almost nobody explains clearly.
Even low light plants, the ones marketed as perfect for dark corners, still need some usable light to survive long term. They can tolerate lower light better than other plants, but tolerate doesn't mean thrive. A lot of those plants are technically alive in a dark corner for a long time, but they're not growing. They're just existing in survival mode,
Slowly using up stored energy until they eventually decline. Medium or indirect light usually means a spot a few feet back from a window that doesn't get direct sun but still gets a good, bright, open view of the sky. Bright indirect light usually means right next to a window or a few feet back from a window that gets a lot of direct sun during the day, with something like a sheer curtain to soften it. Here's a simple way to actually test the light in your space. Instead of guessing based on how bright it looks to your eyes, during the brightest part of the day, hold your hand about a foot above the surface where your plant is sitting. If you see a sharp, clearly defined shadow with crisp edges, that's bright light. If you see a soft shadow, one that's visible but blurry around the edges, that's medium light.
if you can barely see a shadow at all, or there's no shadow, that's low light, and most plants are going to struggle there long term. This test takes 10 seconds, and it tells you way more about your actual light conditions than just looking around the room and deciding it seems bright enough. So, what do you actually do with this information? First, walk around your apartment and do that shadow test in every spot where you have a plant.
Not just once, but at a few different times of day, because light conditions change depending on the angle of the sun. A spot that looks bright at noon might be almost dark by 4 p.m. Second, match your plants to the right spots based on what you find.
If a plant is sitting somewhere that only produces a faint or invisible shadow, and that plant isn't specifically rated for very low light, it needs to move closer to a window, even if that means rearranging your whole space. Third, if you can't physically move a plant closer to natural light because of the layout of your apartment or just personal preference, consider a simple grow light. You don't need anything fancy or expensive. Even a basic LED grow light bulb, the kind that screws into a regular lamp running for about 8 to 10 hours a day, can completely change how a plant performs in a dim corner. Fourth, and this is important, stop adjusting your watering schedule as the first fix when a plant looks unhappy. Before you touch the watering can, check the light first. If the plant is in a low light spot and showing yellow leaves or slow decline, moving it to better light is very often gonna fix the exact same symptoms that overwatering causes. Because remember, low light makes plants use water way slower than normal. Here's the bigger idea I want you to walk away with. A lot of what gets blamed on bad watering habits is actually a light problem wearing a watering problem's disguise. The two are so closely connected that fixing one without checking the other usually doesn't work. Next time a plant of yours looks a little off, stretched out, smaller leaves, slow to grow, don't just reach for the watering can or start Googling fertilizer schedules. Do the shadow test first.
9 times out of 10, that 15-second test is going to tell you more about what's actually wrong than anything else you could check. And if you've been blaming yourself for having a black thumb this whole time, there's a real chance it was never about your watering skills at all. It was about a spot in your apartment that looked bright enough to your eyes, but was never bright enough for the plant. If this helped you understand your plants a little better, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, where I break down another mistake almost nobody notices until it's already too late.